All right, so picking up from where we left off in the last video, I've made a couple changes over here. So as you may see, let me just go ahead and let's get rid of this plugin GUI for a second over here. I've got a MIDI event in my DAW of choice, which happens to be Studio One. And I've gone ahead and I've done a little bit of MIDI programming over here. So let's go ahead here and we'll open up our GUI again. And if we were to engage playback from our DAW, since we have host mode on, essentially we will be triggering playback of all of these layers from within Regroover Pro. You'll notice that I have a loop mode or a loop cycle mode engaged in my DAW, and that's a 4-bar loop, which happens to equal the same loop range that we have for all these different layers. So let's go ahead and let's press play. Okay, so you can see that we have the basic layers are playing over here. If I was to power down some of these layers, you'll notice that we are missing those elements. And of course, we can solo these as well. Now, the one thing that I've done is since we already went ahead and we extracted some of these samples, and we know we can do that just by double clicking over here, using these drag handles to determine the range, or we can engage a grid mode if we wanted to do this against a grid. And this would obviously snap to these boundaries over here. And then by clicking and holding, and until we have that status bar, we could just drag this to any of those expansion pads over here. You'll notice that I've gone ahead and I've done a little bit of MIDI programming. So over here, I've essentially gone through and I've just added some elements. Now keep in mind, these elements that I've added are one-shots that were generated from the isolated layers over here in our instrument. So let's go ahead now. I'm going to go ahead and play this. And with all of these selected over here, let's go ahead and let's unmute them. So you'll notice that we're able to add these extra elements via MIDI programming to the layers that are already playing in its cycle mode in Regroover Pro. We can go ahead and we can delete these as well, or rather mute them. Now let's take a look at these elements individually on their own. So I'm just going to use some shortcuts over here to basically highlight these different sections. Let's bring in our kicks first. So I've simply added some elements over here and over here as well. And then let's go ahead and let's mute those. And then the next one we'll take a look at is all of our snares. And then of course we have our hi-hats. I'm just using some shortcuts to be able to bring these in. Let's go ahead and in fact these ones, let's mute all these. So now we're just listening to the hi-hats that have been added. Okay, so not the greatest job of drum programming there, but this is all about understanding the concept that once we have these additional elements that have been added, where we were able to drag and drop these into our expansion kit, these can all be triggered via MIDI notes on our keyboard. So we have C5, C#5, D5, etc. And then you would simply go about programming your MIDI as if though you were using any drum instrument or virtual instrument, where you could essentially map out your samples to the individual pads and then program that MIDI out. And since this is a stereo instance, we're listening to essentially a stereo mix that's coming out of this channel over here. Let me just go ahead for a moment. Let's open up our mixer. And everything that's happening in this case is happening on the actual fader over here, because this is all set to come out of the same stereo output. Now we're going to have a look at adjusting and changing this in a later video, but essentially you can see here the type of potential that we have in terms of being able to program additional hits. So if you say to yourself, you know what, I really like the bass of this pattern over here, but I really wish there was some extra elements added, you could essentially come in here and you could add in anything that you want. As long as we have those samples, when we've cleaned up our layers, we were able to extract really clean one-shots. We can essentially program any MIDI that we want. Now, another thing that we can do, which is what we're going to have a look at in the next video, is we can also apply effects to these individual pads over here. So if you notice that as I click this over here, we have our envelope section and we have our effects section. So that's what we're going to take a look at in the next video, is adjusting the effects section of these individual pads. So we'll catch you in the next video.